And the problem with your generation, the judge's voice boomed, echoing off the marbled walls of the courtroom, is this overwhelming sense of entitlement. You walk in here dressed like you're heading to a skate park, and you expect respect? 17-year-old Marcus Marshall stood alone before the bench, the scratchy fabric of his court-appointed public defender's jacket feeling alien on his shoulders. He kept his eyes fixed on the Georgia state seal behind Judge Arthur Redding's head, a symbol of justice that felt like a cruel joke in that moment. His crime? A broken taillight and the audacity to ask a police officer why he was being pulled over in his own neighborhood. Now, he was a prop in this judge's morning lecture on the moral decay of society, a lecture aimed squarely at the color of his skin. The air in Fulton County Magistrate Court was thick and stale, smelling of old paper, cheap disinfectant, and the quiet desperation of a Monday morning docket. For Marcus, it smelled like injustice. Judge Redding, a man whose jowls shook with every self-righteous pronouncement, leaned forward over his imposing oak bench, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He peered down at Marcus not as a citizen, but as a nuisance, another file to be stamped and forgotten. Let's see here. Marcus. No last name I can pronounce, the judge muttered, feigning difficulty with Marshall, a name as common as any. He made a show of squinting at the file. Charged with failure to comply and resisting arrest, at 17. You're starting early, son. What's your story? Let me guess. No father at home? A mother working 2 jobs who can't keep an eye on you? Each question was a hammer blow, shaping a narrative that had nothing to do with Marcus's life. He thought of his father, Elias Marshall, a man who rose before the sun every morning to read constitutional law briefs, a man whose quiet integrity was the foundation of their family. He thought of his mother, Dr. Annalise Marshall, a renowned history professor at Emory University, whose lessons on the long, brutal fight for civil rights were the soundtrack of his childhood. They were the very definition of present. His public defender, a harried man named Mr. Davies, who had met him for all of 3 minutes in the hallway, shifted his weight. Your Honor, my client has no priors. He is an honor roll student at North Atlanta High. This seems to be a misunderstanding that escalated. Redding waved a dismissive hand, cutting him off. A misunderstanding? Officer Miller's report says the defendant became belligerent and aggressive. It says here he postured as if to fight. Body cam footage was inconclusive, he added, the word dripping with skepticism, as if the camera itself were part of the conspiracy against law and order. The word belligerent hung in the air. Marcus remembered the incident with sickening clarity. He'd been driving home from his architecture internship, his mind filled with blueprints and load-bearing walls. He was in his mother's 5-year-old sedan, not some flashy car. He was 2 blocks from his own driveway in Ansley Park, a neighborhood of historic homes and manicured lawns where he'd lived his entire life. The blue and red lights flared in his rearview mirror, a sudden, jarring intrusion. Officer Miller had been young, with a military-style haircut and an attitude to match. License and registration. You know why I pulled you over? No, sir, I don't, Marcus had said, his hands already on the wheel, just as his father had taught him. The driving while black lesson. A rite of passage he'd hoped was a relic of his parents' generation. Your right taillight is out, and you rolled through that stop sign back there. Marcus knew for a fact the taillight had been working that morning. He'd done a walk-around of the car, and he was certain he'd come to a complete stop. I'm sorry, officer, but I'm sure I stopped, and I checked the lights this morning. The officer's eyes narrowed. Are you calling me a liar, boy? The word, boy, was a switch. It flipped the interaction from a routine traffic stop to something older, something uglier. Marcus felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, the anger his father always warned him to control. No, sir, he said, his voice level. I'm just stating what I know. Could you tell me what I supposedly did wrong to warrant this? That was when it had escalated. The officer ordered him out of the car. When Marcus asked why, his question was taken as defiance. He was pulled from the vehicle, his arm twisted behind his back, his face pressed against the cool metal of the car door. The charge of resisting was for the simple act of tensing up as a stranger manhandled him. Now in court, that entire terrifying, humiliating experience was being flattened into a few lines in a police report, interpreted by a judge who had already tried and convicted him in his mind. "Look at you," Redding continued, his voice laced with theatrical disappointment. "A strong young man. You could be doing something with your life. Instead, you're in my courtroom, wasting the taxpayers' money and my time. You think these laws don't apply to you? Is that it?" Marcus's jaw was tight. He wanted to scream. He wanted to lay out the facts, to explain the context, to show the judge the photos on his phone of the architectural models he'd been building, the scholarship letters he'd received, the life he was leading that was a universe away from the one being invented for him on this stand. But his father's voice echoed in his head, a memory from a long-ago conversation. In a courtroom, Marcus, the loudest voice, isn't the one that's heard. It's the one with the most credibility. You build your credibility not with volume, but with facts, with respect for the process, even when the process doesn't respect you. Wait for your moment. So he waited. He stood in the charged silence, enduring the judge's tirade. He was no longer just Marcus. He was a symbol, a stereotype, a blank canvas onto which Judge Redding could project all his preconceived notions. And in the cold, uncaring theater of the court, the truth didn't seem to matter at all. The only thing that mattered was the story the man with the gavel chose to tell. The memory of the traffic stop was a film reel stuck on a loop in Marcus's mind, each detail more vivid and infuriating with every replay. It had been a Thursday. The golden light of a late Atlanta afternoon slanted through the oak trees, casting long shadows across the quiet, winding streets of his neighborhood. He was listening to a podcast about sustainable urban design, the calm, academic voices a stark contrast to the sudden violence of the police siren. After being pulled from his car, the rough texture of Officer Miller's polyester uniform scraped against his cheek. The metallic smell of his mother's car, a scent usually associated with comfort and safety, now smelled of fear. "I'm not resisting," Marcus had grunted, the words muffled against the door. "You're hurting my arm." "Stop moving and it won't hurt," Miller retorted, applying more pressure. A second officer, older and heavier, stood by, watching with a bored expression, as if this were a play he'd seen 100 times. They cuffed him. The cold steel bit into his wrists. He was spun around to face Miller, whose face was now flushed with exertion and authority. "You have a real attitude problem, you know that?" Miller said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're smart, asking all these questions?" "I have a right to know why I'm being arrested," Marcus said, his own voice shaking slightly, a betraying tremor of adrenaline and fear. He was acutely aware of his neighbor's curtains twitching. Mrs. Gable from 3 doors down was walking her golden retriever, her pace slowing as she took in the scene, her face a mask of concern and curiosity. The humiliation burned hotter than the anger. He was a good kid. He didn't just think it. He knew it. He spent his weekends volunteering with Habitat for Humanity, not because it looked good on college applications, but because he genuinely loved the smell of sawdust and the feeling of building something real for a family who needed it. He was a peer tutor in calculus. He was the one his friends called when they needed a designated driver. Yet none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was what Officer Miller saw. A young black man in a hoodie driving a decent car in a nice neighborhood. An anomaly. A threat. "You're being arrested for obstructing a police officer in the performance of his duties," Miller said, reciting the line as if by rote. "You failed to follow a lawful order to remain calm." "Remain calm is not a lawful order. It's advice," Marcus shot back, the words out of his mouth before he could stop them. His father's lessons on constitutional law were a double-edged sword. He knew his rights, but asserting them was being interpreted as aggression. The second officer finally spoke. "Just get in the car, kid. Don't make it worse." He'd spent 4 hours in a holding cell at the precinct on Peachtree Street. The cell was cold, concrete, and smelled faintly of urine. He was the youngest person in there by at least a decade. He'd used his one phone call to contact his parents. He'd expected his father to be angry, but Elias Marshall's voice had been eerily calm, a controlled quiet that was far more unsettling than shouting. "Just tell me what happened, son, exactly as it happened." Marcus recounted the story, his voice cracking. He felt like a child again, not a 17-year-old on the cusp of adulthood. "Okay," Elias said when he'd finished. "Don't say anything else to anyone, not a word. I'll make some calls." His parents had arrived an hour later. His mother's face was etched with a familiar mixture of fear and fury he'd seen whenever she watched a news report about another unarmed black man being killed by police. His father's expression was unreadable, his jaw set like stone. He didn't hug Marcus. He simply put a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity and support that meant more than any words. They'd hired a lawyer, a family friend, who assured them the charges were baseless and would be dropped. But the system moved at its own pace. The arresting officer's report was filed. The district attorney's office, swamped with cases, pushed it through to the magistrate court. It was a minor offense, something that should have been handled with a citation. But the resisting charge, baseless as it was, triggered a mandatory appearance. "We could fight this, Marcus," his father had told him in his study, the walls lined with books that seemed to hold the entire history of American law. "We could file a complaint against the officer. We could take this to trial. But it would be your word against his, and in the current climate, it's a risk. A conviction, even for a misdemeanor, could affect your scholarships." "So I'm supposed to just plead guilty to something I didn't do?" Marcus asked, incredulous. "No," Elias said firmly. "You never plead guilty. The lawyer will ask for a dismissal or, at worst, an adjudication withheld, where it's dropped after you complete some minor conditions. It's not about justice, son. Not at this level. This is about navigating a system that is not designed for you. It's a bitter pill to swallow, I know. That conversation had been 2 weeks ago. Now, standing in Judge Redding's courtroom, the bitter pill was lodged in his throat. His lawyer, Mr. Davies, was the public defender on duty that day because their family lawyer had gotten stuck in traffic. A cruel twist of fate. A text message a few minutes ago confirmed he was still 20 minutes out. They'd decided Marcus should just go ahead with Davies, as this was supposed to be a simple, procedural hearing. A formality. Instead, it had become a public stripping of his dignity. Redding was still talking, his monologue veering into a diatribe about personal responsibility. "The problem is, nobody wants to take responsibility for their actions anymore," the judge declared, looking out at the small audience in the courtroom. "It's always someone else's fault. The system is unfair. The officer was racist. The taillight was working yesterday. I hear it all day long. A symphony of excuses." Marcus felt the blood pounding in his ears. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a personal attack, a deliberate and public humiliation. He looked at Mr. Davies, who offered a helpless shrug. He looked at the bored-looking prosecutor, who was doodling on a legal pad. No one was going to help him. His father's advice about waiting for his moment felt distant and naive. In this room, under these fluorescent lights, it felt like there would be no moment. There was only the relentless, grinding power of a man who saw him not as a person, but as a problem. Judge Redding paused, taking a sip of water from a plastic cup. The small act seemed theatrical, a deliberate pause for effect before his next volley. He set the cup down and folded his hands, his gaze still fixed on Marcus. "Where do you live, son?" he asked, though the address was clearly printed on the file in front of him. "Ansley Park, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice quiet but steady. Redding raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He clearly hadn't bothered to read that part of the report. Ansley Park? Really? He scanned the courtroom, a smirk playing on his lips. Must be nice. How does a young man like yourself afford to live in a neighborhood like that? Let me guess. You're one of those basketball prodigies? The question was so loaded, so dripping with condescending stereotype, that for a moment Marcus was speechless. He thought of the home he grew up in, a beautiful but modest century-old house his parents had bought when they were young academics, long before his father's prestigious appointment. It was filled with books, music, and the smell of his mother's cooking. It was a home, not a mansion. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, sensing the conversation was veering into dangerous territory. Your Honor, my client's family residence has no bearing on this case. Everything has a bearing on the case, Mr. Davies, Redding snapped, his good old boy demeanor vanishing. It speaks to character, to circumstance. I'm trying to understand the full picture here. We have a young man from a privileged background acting like a common street thug. It's a disconnect. I'm trying to bridge it. The words street thug struck Marcus like a physical blow. He felt a cold rage settle in his stomach. He had spent his entire life carefully navigating the world, being twice as good, twice as polite, twice as careful, just to avoid that exact label. He code-switched at school, with his friends, at his internship. He wore his backpack with both straps, kept his music low, and never wore a hoodie at night. He had done everything right, and it still hadn't mattered. He saw the faces in the courtroom. A few people waiting for their own cases looked on with sympathy. Others, with the same hard, judgmental stare as the judge. They were all participating in his humiliation, either as perpetrators or as silent witnesses. Mr. Marshall, the judge said, finally using his name, though it sounded like an accusation. Do you think you are better than everyone else? Is that why you felt you didn't have to comply with Officer Miller's instructions? Because you live in a nice house and Mommy and Daddy buy you everything you want? This was the narrative Redding had settled on. If he wasn't a fatherless kid from the ghetto, then he must be a spoiled, entitled, rich kid. There was no room in the judge's worldview for a third option, a normal, intelligent, respectful young black man who had been unjustly targeted. No, Your Honor, Marcus said, forcing the words through his clenched jaw. I was taught to respect the law. I was also taught to ask questions when I believe my rights are being violated. The judge leaned back, a genuine smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a cat who had just cornered a mouse. Oh, a constitutional scholar now, are we? Citing your rights. Let me teach you a little something about rights, son. Your rights end when an officer's safety is in question. When you posture, when you argue, when you act like you're above the law, you create a dangerous situation. Officer Miller did what he had to do to de-escalate. De-escalate. The word was a perversion of the truth. Miller had been the one to escalate at every turn. Marcus had been the one trying to remain calm, trying to inject reason into a situation spiraling out of control. I understand you have a difficult job, Your Honor, Mr. Davies interjected, trying to smooth things over. My client is young. He's never been in trouble before. He's learned his lesson. We are asking the court for leniency and a dismissal of the charges. Redding scoffed. Leniency? Dismissal? That's the problem. There are no consequences anymore. Everyone wants a pass. Well, the free passes end in this courtroom. This young man needs to learn a lesson about humility, about respecting authority. He picked up his gavel, tapping it lightly on the block. The sound was a punctuation mark to his power. I'm not going to ruin your life, Mr. Marshall. Not today. Though you seem to be doing a fine job of that on your own. But you're not getting a free pass either. He looked down at the file again. I'm dropping the failure to comply. But on the charge of resisting arrest without violence, I find you guilty. Mr. Davies started to protest, but Redding held up a hand. Don't even start, counselor. I'm adjudicating him as a youthful offender. It won't be on his permanent adult record if he stays out of trouble. It was meant to sound like an act of mercy, but it felt like a trap. "Sentence is 40 hours of community service," Redding declared, his voice ringing with finality, "and a $500 fine to cover the court costs you so carelessly incurred, and a mandatory anger management course. It seems you have a problem with authority." He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes cold and devoid of empathy. "Maybe," the judge said, his voice dropping to a confidential, condescending tone. "A little hard labor picking up trash on the highway will teach you the value of things, teach you some respect for the people who work for a living, instead of having everything handed to you on a silver platter by your folks." The courtroom was silent. The sentence was disproportionate, punitive, and designed to humiliate. But it was the final comment that broke something inside Marcus. The assumption about his parents, about his life, about his character, was a final, unbearable insult. This wasn't about a broken taillight anymore. It wasn't even about Officer Miller. It was about this man, Judge Arthur Redding, a man who wore a black robe and wielded the power of the state, using it to crush, belittle, and demean a young man he knew nothing about. His father's advice about waiting for the right moment came back to him, but this time it had a different meaning. The moment wasn't something you waited for. It was something you made. A profound calm washed over Marcus. The pounding in his ears ceased. The heat in his chest cooled to a sharp, focused point. In that moment, the fear, the humiliation, and the anger all coalesced into a single, unshakable resolve. He would not leave this courtroom as the person Judge Redding thought he was. He took a half-step forward, his movement so subtle it barely registered. Mr. Davies put a restraining hand on his arm, but Marcus gently shook it off. "Your Honor," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the thick silence of the courtroom with startling clarity. It was a new voice, one he hadn't known he possessed. It was steady, measured, and held an authority that seemed to surprise even himself. Judge Redding looked up, annoyed by the interruption. He was already reaching for the next file on his docket. "What is it now, Mr. Marshall? The sentence has been handed down. We're done here." "With all due respect, Your Honor, we are not," Marcus said. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. A bailiff standing against the side wall straightened up, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. Mr. Davies looked at Marcus with wide, panicked eyes, mouthing the word, "Stop," but Marcus held the judge's gaze. "You have lectured me on responsibility, entitlement, and respect for the law. So I would like to respectfully point out that you have failed in your own responsibilities here today." Redding's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, began to cloud over with disbelief and then fury. "You are in contempt of court, young man. One more word out of you and I'll have you in a holding cell so fast your head will spin." "On what grounds?" Marcus asked, his tone genuinely curious. "For disagreeing with you? For pointing out errors in your judgment? The First Amendment hasn't been suspended at the door to this courtroom, has it?" He was channeling his father now, the quiet, Socratic method Elias used to dismantle flawed arguments piece by piece. The judge was turning a shade of purple. "Bailiff!" he barked. The bailiff started to move forward, a large man with a weary expression. "Your Honor, under the Georgia Code of Judicial Conduct, Canon 3, a judge is required to be patient, dignified, and courteous to litigants, lawyers, and others with whom the judge deals in an official capacity," Marcus continued, his voice never rising. "You have been none of those things. You have been impatient, undignified, and profoundly discourteous. You have made baseless assumptions about my family, my character, and my life." He took a breath. "You also have a duty to perform judicial duties without bias or prejudice, yet your every word has been dripping with prejudice based on my age, my race, and my appearance." The prosecutor was now standing, his mouth slightly agape. Mr. Davies looked like he was about to faint. The entire courtroom was frozen, watching the unbelievable scene unfold. A 17-year-old was lecturing a veteran judge on judicial ethics. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" Redding roared, slamming his hand down on the bench. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "You have no right to stand there and lecture me. I am the law in this room." "That's where you're mistaken, Your Honor," Marcus said, his calm unwavering. "The law is the law. You are merely its servant. A servant who, in this instance, seems to have forgotten his place." The bailiff had reached him now and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "That's enough, son. Come on." Marcus did not resist. He did not even look at the bailiff. His eyes remained locked on Judge Redding, who was sputtering, speechless with rage. "My name," Marcus said, his voice ringing with a newfound power, "is Marcus Thurgood Marshall. My mother is Dr. Annalise Marshall, head of the history department at Emory. And my father—" He paused, letting the weight of the moment build. He let the judge, the bailiff, the prosecutor, and everyone in that room hang on his next words. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, a fact that was about to change everything. "Is Elias Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Georgia." The name landed in the silent courtroom like a physical object. It shattered the atmosphere of ingrained power and casual cruelty that Judge Redding had cultivated. The bailiff's hand, which had been gripping Marcus's shoulder, suddenly felt less like a restraint and more like an unwanted familiarity. The bailiff slowly, almost unconsciously, removed it. The prosecutor's face went from shock to a pale, sickly white. He looked at Judge Redding as if he were a dead man walking. Mr. Davies, who had been hunched in defeat, slowly straightened up, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. He looked at Marcus, then back at the judge, and a small, incredulous smile touched his lips. Judge Arthur Redding just stared. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like old parchment. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The robe, which moments before had been a symbol of his absolute authority, now seemed like a cheap costume. He was just a man, a flawed and frightened man who had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. The boy he had called a thug, the boy he had mocked and sentenced, was the son of the most powerful jurist in the state. And he had just been caught, on the record, abusing his power in the most egregious way imaginable. In the profound, ringing silence, Marcus stood tall. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't used threats. He had used the truth. And the truth, he now realized, was more powerful than any gavel. The silence in the courtroom stretched for what felt like an eternity. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with the unspoken thoughts of everyone present. The dawning horror on Judge Redding's face, the frantic calculations of the young prosecutor, the stunned awe of the other defendants waiting their turn. Judge Redding finally found his voice, but it was a reedy, thin version of its former boom. Is this some kind of a joke?" he stammered, looking from Marcus to Mr. Davies, searching for a sign that this was all a prank, a moment of teenage delusion. Mr. Davies, now emboldened, stepped forward. "It is no joke, Your Honor. I can assure you that my client is indeed the son of Chief Justice Marshall." He paused, then added with a touch of relish, "And for the record, our primary counsel, Mr. Alan Dershowitz, who was delayed, has just arrived at the courthouse." The mention of one of the most famous and aggressive civil rights attorneys in Atlanta was the final nail in the coffin. If revealing his father's identity was a bomb, this was the secondary explosion. Redding's eyes darted towards the courtroom doors, as if expecting the devil himself to walk through them. He looked back at Marcus, and for the first time, he saw him. He didn't see a thug or a statistic. He saw a young man who carried himself with a poise and intelligence that he had been willfully blind to. He saw the face of his own ruin. He began to backtrack, his words clumsy and panicked. Well, perhaps I was a bit hasty in my judgment, in light of the defendant's exemplary background, which was not made clear to me. He fumbled with the papers on his desk, his hands shaking slightly. Mr. Davies, perhaps you and the prosecutor can discuss a revised disposition. The prosecutor, a young man named Harris, looked like a deer in the headlights. He wanted to be as far from this situation as possible. Yes, Your Honor, of course. We would be amenable to that. But Marcus wasn't finished. He had not done this to get out of a trumped-up charge. He had done this because it was wrong. What had happened to him was wrong, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that it happened every single day in this very courtroom to young men who didn't have a Chief Justice for a father. No, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the judge's pathetic attempts at retreat. We will not be discussing a revised disposition. I believe the original verdict stands. You found me guilty. You sentenced me. It's all on the record, isn't it? The court stenographer, a woman who had been typing impassively for the entire morning, suddenly looked up, her fingers frozen over the keys. She knew, better than anyone, what was on that record. Every condescending remark, every biased assumption, every abuse of power. Redding stared at Marcus, bewildered. "What do you want, son?" he asked, the word son now laced with a desperate, pleading tone. "I want my sentence," Marcus said calmly. "The 40 hours of community service, the $500 fine, the anger management classes. I accept it. But I want it noted that I am doing so under protest, and that the transcript of this entire proceeding be prepared and certified immediately." It was a brilliant move, one born of pure, instinctual clarity. By accepting the sentence, he was cementing the injustice. He was preserving the evidence. A dismissed case could be swept under the rug. A guilty verdict, handed down under these circumstances, was a time bomb. Mr. Davies caught on immediately. "That's correct, Your Honor. We will not be seeking a dismissal at this time. We will let your verdict stand, and we will be requesting a full, unedited copy of the transcript and all audio and video recordings of this hearing." Judge Redding looked as if he might be physically ill. He was trapped. Reversing his own verdict now would be a blatant admission of guilt, an obvious attempt at a cover-up. Letting it stand was professional suicide. Marcus had not only turned the tables, he had dismantled the entire table, piece by piece. Case number 734B. The court will take a brief recess, Redding mumbled, his authority utterly shattered. He slammed the gavel down, but the sound had no force. It was the hollow tap of a defeated man. He practically fled the courtroom through a side door, his black robe billowing behind him like a funeral shroud. The moment the door closed, the courtroom erupted in hushed, frantic whispers. Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Mr. Davies, his face alight with a mixture of shock and admiration. "In 20 years as a public defender, I have never seen anything like that. Ever. Your father would be... Hell, he will be proud." Marcus simply nodded, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a profound exhaustion in its wake. He walked out of the courtroom, past the stunned faces of the other people waiting for their cases. He felt their eyes on him, a mixture of awe and hope. In the hallway, a tall, impeccably dressed man with graying temples was striding towards them. Alan Dershowitz. "Marcus," he said, his voice a low, concerned rumble. "I am so sorry I was late. What happened? I heard a commotion." Before Marcus could answer, Mr. Davies stepped in, a huge grin on his face. "What happened, Alan, is that your client just single-handedly dismantled a sitting judge with nothing but the Georgia Code of Judicial Conduct and the truth. You've got to see this. It was biblical." Marcus pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking now. He had 3 missed calls from his father and a text message that read, "Court running late. Everything okay?" He took a deep breath and scrolled through his contacts. He didn't call his father. He didn't call his mother. he made a different call. He knew this was bigger than just his family now. He dialed the number of a woman he'd met through his mother, a woman who was a friend, a mentor, and one of the most respected investigative journalists at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "Hey, Rachel," he said when she answered. "It's Marcus Marshall. You are not going to believe the story I have for you." The certified transcript of the proceedings in Judge Arthur Redding's courtroom landed on Rachel Diaz's desk at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution less than 24 hours later. It was 42 pages long, a dry, factual account of a legal hearing that, on the surface, was unremarkable. But as Rachel read it, a slow burn of professional outrage began to build. She knew the players. She had covered the Fulton County Courthouse for years. She knew Judge Redding by reputation, a hard-liner, popular with the law and order crowd, but often criticized in private by defense attorneys for his courtroom demeanor and his tendency to hand down disproportionately harsh sentences to minority defendants. But reputation was one thing. A verbatim transcript was another. The words on the page were damning. The court. Let's see here. Marcus. No last name I can pronounce. The court. What's your story? Let me guess. No father at home? The court. How does a young man like yourself afford to live in a neighborhood like that? Let me guess. You're one of those basketball prodigies? The court. We have a young man from a privileged background acting like a common street thug. Rachel highlighted each phrase. It was a masterclass in judicial misconduct, a tapestry of bias, prejudice, and abuse of power, all woven together in the span of a 15-minute hearing. And then came the climax, Marcus's calm, methodical takedown of the judge, culminating in the revelation of his father's identity. It was a courtroom drama better than anything Hollywood could invent. But the most powerful part, for Rachel, was Marcus's final act, accepting the unjust sentence. It transformed him from a victim into a strategist. He had ensured that Judge Redding's misconduct was permanently etched into the public record. Her editor, a grizzled veteran named Ben, read the transcript over her shoulder, letting out a low whistle. "This isn't just a story, Rachel. This is a bombshell." "And the kid recorded the audio on his phone," Rachel added, pressing play on a file Marcus had sent her. The tinny courtroom audio filled the quiet newsroom. Hearing Redding's booming, condescending voice, followed by Marcus's clear, steady responses, made the injustice even more visceral. "Get the body cam footage from the arrest," Ben ordered. "Talk to legal ethics experts. Get a comment from the Judicial Qualifications Commission. And for God's sake, be careful how you approach the Chief Justice's office. This is a minefield." The story exploded 2 days later. It was the Sunday front page, above the fold, with the headline, "Street Thug in the Dock was Chief Justice's Son. Transcript reveals shocking abuse of power by Fulton Judge." The public reaction was immediate and volcanic. Talk radio lines lit up. Social media was a firestorm. The hashtags Dr. Judge Redding and for Marcus Marshall trended for 2 days straight. The audio clip of the exchange went viral. People who had never thought twice about the inner workings of a magistrate court were suddenly debating the Georgia Code of Judicial Conduct. The story was a perfect storm. It had a clear villain in Judge Redding and a sympathetic, heroic protagonist in Marcus. But more than that, it tapped into a deep, simmering resentment about a two-tiered justice system. The unspoken question hung in the air. What would have happened if Marcus Marshall wasn't the Chief Justice's son? Everyone knew the answer. He would have 40 hours of community service, a $500 fine, and an anger management class on his record. He would have become another statistic, another young black man branded as a troublemaker by a system designed to see him that way. His identity had not gotten him into trouble. It had saved him from it. And that reality was more damning than anything Judge Redding had said. At the Marshall house, a quiet siege was underway. News vans were camped out at the end of their street. The phone rang incessantly. Annalise and Elias shielded Marcus from the worst of it, creating a bubble of calm in the eye of the hurricane. Elias Marshall had been silent for 2 days. As the highest-ranking judge in the state, he was in an impossible position. To speak out as a father would be seen as using his position to influence the outcome. To remain silent as Chief Justice would be seen as ignoring a blatant case of judicial rot under his watch. On the 3rd day, he called a press conference. He stood at a podium in the Grand Hall of the Georgia Supreme Court building, the same building where Marcus's class had taken a field trip years earlier. He did not look like a father. He looked like a Chief Justice. His face was grim, his voice measured and imbued with the full authority of his office. "I will not be commenting on the specific case involving my son," he began, his voice steady. "That matter is now, quite properly, the subject of an official inquiry. I am here today to speak to the broader and more troubling issues that this incident has raised." He spoke for 10 minutes. He did not mention Judge Redding by name. He didn't have to. He spoke about the sacred trust placed in the judiciary. He spoke about the absolute, non-negotiable requirement for judges to be impartial, courteous, and free from bias. He spoke about how the perception of injustice is as corrosive to the rule of law as injustice itself. "Any judge who cannot or will not uphold these core principles," he said, his voice dropping to a steely quiet, "has no place on the bench in the state of Georgia. Period." He then announced that the Judicial Qualifications Commission, the independent body that investigates and disciplines judges, had opened a formal investigation. He also announced the formation of a new statewide task force appointed by him to review judicial training, conduct, and the mechanisms for reporting bias in the courtroom. It was a declaration of war. He was using the crisis not just to address one rogue judge, but to launch a systemic reform. He had taken the ugly, personal incident involving his son and was using his power to try and fix the system that had allowed it to happen. Watching his father on television, Marcus felt a surge of pride that eclipsed everything else. His father was doing exactly what he had always taught him to do, using the tools of the law to bend the arc of the moral universe, however slightly, toward justice. The tempest that had started in that small, stale courtroom was now poised to reshape the entire judicial landscape of the state. The investigation by the Judicial Qualifications Commission, JQC, was swift and merciless. Armed with the official transcript, the audio recording, and the viral news coverage, their job was less an investigation and more a confirmation. They subpoenaed Judge Redding's case history, and a disturbing pattern emerged. Rachel Diaz's follow-up stories in the AJC were relentless. She uncovered a dozen other cases over the past 5 years where Redding had been accused of biased or inappropriate remarks from the bench, primarily directed at young minority defendants. These were complaints that had been filed and subsequently dismissed, buried in the bureaucratic shuffle. But now, under the white-hot glare of public scrutiny, they were undeniable evidence of a long-standing problem. Past defendants, emboldened by Marcus's story, began to come forward. A young Latina woman spoke about how Redding had mockingly asked if she needed a translator, even though she was a native Atlantan and a graduate of Georgia Tech. A young black man, given a 6-month sentence for shoplifting a tube of toothpaste, described how Redding had lectured him on being a drain on society. Their stories painted a picture of a judge who used his bench as a bully pulpit, dispensing not justice, but his own brand of bitter, personal prejudice. Judge Redding was suspended pending the outcome of the JQC hearing. He became a pariah. His photo was everywhere. He was heckled at the grocery store. His law school, a prestigious Southern institution, quietly removed his portrait from their hall of distinguished alumni. The political allies who had once championed his tough-on-crime, judicial philosophy, were now silent, distancing themselves from the unfolding scandal. The JQC hearing was a formality. Redding's lawyer attempted to argue that his client's words were being taken out of context, that he was an old-school judge who used harsh language to try and scare kids straight. The argument fell flat. The 7-member panel, composed of other judges, lawyers, and citizen members, was unmoved. The evidence was overwhelming. The transcript was the prosecution's star witness, an unimpeachable account of the judge's own words. The body cam footage from Marcus's arrest was also played. It showed a calm, polite 17-year-old being goaded and then arrested by an aggressive officer. The original charge, the broken tail light, was proven false when the impound lot's intake photos showed both lights were perfectly intact. Officer Miller was placed on administrative leave, facing his own internal affairs investigation. Faced with the JQC's unanimous recommendation for his removal from the bench, Judge Arthur Redding chose to resign. He issued a short, terse statement through his lawyer, admitting no wrongdoing but stating that the media circus surrounding the case had made it impossible for him to continue to serve effectively. He vanished from public life, a man undone by his own arrogance. But the reckoning did not end with Redding's resignation. The task force created by Chief Justice Marshall began its work in earnest. They held public hearings across the state, from the inner-city courts of Atlanta to the rural magistrate courts in South Georgia. They heard testimony from citizens, lawyers, and even other judges who spoke of an entrenched culture of bias that had long been an open secret. The task force's final report was a landmark document. It recommended a complete overhaul of judicial training in Georgia with a new, mandatory annual curriculum focused on implicit bias, cultural competency, and de-escalation techniques. It proposed a simplified and anonymous process for citizens to file complaints against judges, ensuring that they could no longer be so easily dismissed. It also recommended a pilot program for court watching, where citizen volunteers would be trained to observe courtroom proceedings and report on judicial demeanor. The Georgia legislature, under immense public pressure, passed a judicial reform bill based on the task force's recommendations. It was a sea change, a set of reforms that would have been unthinkable just 6 months prior. Marcus watched all of this unfold with a sense of awe and profound responsibility. His personal nightmare had become a catalyst for public good. He gave a single quiet interview to Rachel Diaz, wanting to use his platform one last time. "I was lucky," he told her, sitting on a park bench at Piedmont Park, the Atlanta skyline behind him. "I was lucky because of who my father is. But justice shouldn't be about luck. It shouldn't depend on who your parents are, or what neighborhood you live in, or what you look like. The whole point of the lady with the blindfold is that she's not supposed to be able to see any of that. It feels like, for a long time, too many people on the bench have been peeking." His words, printed in the final article on the affair, became the defining quote of the movement for reform. He had not only won his case, he had helped change the rules of the game. Fall arrived, painting the Emory University campus in brilliant shades of crimson and gold. Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. He was no longer just Marcus Marshall, the Chief Justice's son. He was simply Marcus, a freshman in the university's renowned architecture program, one of hundreds of students bustling across the quad with backpacks and coffee cups. The scandal had faded from the headlines, replaced by the endless cycle of new outrages and political dramas. But its impact lingered. The judicial reforms, dubbed the Marshall Act by the media, were being implemented across the state. The first round of new bias training for judges was underway. 2 other judges, whose conduct had come under scrutiny during the task force hearings, had quietly retired. The ripples were still spreading. Marcus had finished his community service over the summer, choosing to work with a nonprofit that helped exonerate wrongfully convicted prisoners. He'd spent his 40 hours filing paperwork, organizing case files, and listening to heartbreaking stories of lives derailed by a justice system that had failed them. The experience had solidified something in him. His passion for architecture was no longer just about designing beautiful buildings. It was about designing just spaces. One evening, he sat in his dorm room, a space that was a chaotic mix of textbooks, T-squares, and empty snack bags. He wasn't studying for his physics exam. He was sketching in his notepad, not with the precise lines of an architect, but with the free-flowing energy of an artist. He was designing a building. It wasn't a skyscraper or a luxury condo. It was a community justice center. He imagined a building that didn't feel like a courthouse. It would be made of warm wood and glass, not cold stone and marble. There would be natural light, open spaces, and rooms for mediation and restorative justice circles, not just adversarial courtrooms. There would be a law library open to the public, a daycare for parents who had court dates, and offices for social workers and mental health professionals right alongside the public defenders. It was a blueprint for a different kind of justice, one that was welcoming, not intimidating, one that aimed to heal, not just to punish. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his father. "Your mother and I are on campus. Dinner at the usual spot?" He met them at a small, cozy Italian restaurant just off campus. It was their family tradition. Seeing them, he felt a wave of gratitude so profound it almost overwhelmed him. "How are you, son?" Elias asked, his eyes filled with a father's concern. The weight of the past few months had added new lines around his eyes, but his gaze was as steady as ever. "I'm good, Dad. Really good," Marcus said. And he meant it. He showed them his sketches. He explained his idea for a community justice center, his words tumbling out with an excitement he hadn't felt since before the incident. His mother, Annalise, looked at the drawings, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful, Marcus. It's a place for people, not for cases." Elias studied the sketches for a long time, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for 40 years, I've worked to build a more just society using the law as my tool. Statutes, precedents, opinions, it's all I've known." He looked at Marcus, his pride evident. "You're going to build it, literally, with brick and mortar, with light and air. That's an incredible thing." In that moment, Marcus understood. He was not destined to walk in his father's footsteps, to become a lawyer or a judge. His path was his own, but it ran parallel to his father's, aimed at the same distant horizon. He had found his own way to serve, his own blueprint for building a better world. The waiter arrived to take their order. He was a young student, probably around Marcus's age. He glanced at Elias, did a double take of recognition, and then looked at Marcus. "Hey, you're that kid," the waiter said, his eyes wide with admiration. "The one from the courtroom. Man, that was awesome. You're a legend." Marcus just smiled. He wasn't a legend. He was just a kid who had been forced to find his voice. And now that he had found it, he was determined to use it to design a world where no one else would have to go through what he did. He was an architect, after all. And he was just getting started. The story of Marcus Marshall and Judge Redding became more than just a fleeting news item. It became a case study taught in law schools and a cautionary tale whispered in judicial chambers. The Marshall Act led to a measurable drop in citizen complaints and a noticeable shift in courtroom culture across Georgia. It proved that systemic change is possible when a single act of courage shines a light into the darkest corners of a flawed institution. Marcus went on to graduate with honors, his final thesis a revolutionary design for a community-centered justice complex that won a national award and is now being considered for development in a pilot program. He never set foot in a courtroom as a defendant again, but his blueprint for a better, more humane form of justice continues to challenge and inspire. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of justice and accountability. Share this video to spread the message that one voice can make a difference. And tell us in the comments below, what does a truly just system look like to you?